Okay, welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into, 4 decades of really high stakes global tension. We're looking at US foreign policy during the Cold War, specifically from the end of World War II, 1945, right up to about 1980. And the big question we want to tackle is this: how did the United States try to, limit Soviet communist power, push for a free market global economy, and build an international security system, all without kicking off World War III?
Right, and that's the tightrope they walked for decades.
Hmm.
It's fascinating, really, how quickly that wartime alliance between the U.S. and the USSR just evaporated.
Mhm.
It basically dissolved almost overnight. You had these totally irreconcilable ideologies, completely different visions for what the post-war world should look like, and underneath it all, just this profound mutual distrust. And the policies we're going to trace, they weren't set in stone, not at all. They swung back and forth, sometimes wildly, periods of really intense confrontation, proxy wars and standoffs, and then these other brief but significant periods of kind of calculated coexistence, what we now call détente. We'll definitely be looking at both sides of that coin.
Well, let's start at the beginning then, the origin story, because it really kicks off with these two just fundamentally opposing ideas about how society should work. On the American side, you've got democratic capitalism. That means, individual freedoms, private property rights, market economies, and the idea was to spread that model. But the Soviet Union, totally opposite. Authoritarian communism, the state owns everything, rigid one-party political control. And here's the key thing, I think. Both sides genuinely believed their system was the future and actively wanted to expand it globally. That clash right there set the stage for, 40 years of rivalry.
And you see that ideology hit the map almost immediately. The geography right after the war tells a pretty stark story. Stalin didn't waste any time consolidating Soviet control over Eastern Europe. We're talking Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, places where there were supposed to be free elections according to wartime agreements. But that didn't happen. He created this strategic buffer zone against the West.
A buffer zone.
Yeah, a defensive layer.
Sure.
And that friction, it got cemented, physically almost, by the division of Germany and Berlin itself into 4 occupation zones. Winston Churchill famously called it an iron curtain descending across the continent. That phrase wasn't just about the ideology, it really captured the physical separation and, crucially, the early American worry about Soviet expansion pushing west.
Okay, so the threat is expansion. The response, the policy that sticks around for decades, is containment. That becomes the core U.S. strategy, right?
Exactly.
Designed to limit Soviet influence, using, everything but direct war, ideally. Diplomatic pressure, economic leverage, military readiness.
And it wasn't just improvised. There was a real intellectual foundation. You have to look at George Kennan's long telegram in 1946. Kennan, who was stationed in Moscow at the time, sent this incredibly influential analysis back to Washington. He argued that the Soviet Union was inherently expansionist, driven by its ideology, but also, crucially, cautious. It wouldn't risk its own destruction, so it would back down if it met firm, consistent resistance.
So don't provoke a massive war, but stand firm everywhere else. Regional containment.
Precisely. Apply counterpressure wherever they pushed. He recommended using, all the non-military tools first.
But how does a diplomatic cable, even a really smart one, turn into actual global policy so fast? That seems like quite a jump from theory in 46 to action.
Well, it was partly timing, partly necessity, meeting that intellectual framework Kennan provided. The action part really clicks into place in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. Suddenly, the U.S. publicly commits significant aid. It was $400 million, a huge sum then, to Greece and Turkey. Why? Because both were facing active communist insurgencies.
Ah, so that set the precedent.
It absolutely did. The U.S. basically declared itself the protector of nations resisting subjugation, framed very much in ideological terms. Intervention was now on the table.
And this is really where you see the U.S. ditching its old isolationist tendencies for good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Containment meant getting involved everywhere. And the first big tool wasn't military, it was money.
Yes. Economic power first.
We absolutely have to talk about the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948. This was huge. It wasn't just aid, it was deeply strategic. Think of it like an economic vaccine against communism. Over $13 billion poured into rebuilding Western Europe, France, Italy, West Germany especially. The thinking was simple. Desperate people in ruined economies might turn to communism. So rebuild the economies, stabilize the democracies, and you contain the threat. Stability was defense.
And you saw a really dramatic non-military test of this containment resolve just a year later. The Berlin airlift 48 to 49, when the Soviets tried to squeeze the Western Allies out by blockading all land and water access to West Berlin, the U.S. and Britain responded with this unbelievable airlift.
It's hard to even picture the scale.
It really is. Over 200,000 flights in less than a year. Flying in everything, food, coal for heat, medicine, you name it, just constant flights day and night. They kept West Berlin alive and stopped a communist takeover without firing a single shot. It was this incredibly powerful demonstration of peaceful resolve.
And that success, that demonstration of commitment, it leads directly to institutionalizing the military side of containment, right? NATO.
Exactly. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949. This formalized the military alliance. Mutual defense, an attack on one is an attack on all. It locked the U.S. into the defense of Western Europe and served as a major deterrent to any Soviet military moves westward.
And the Soviets, naturally, responded. A few years later, 1955, they formed the Warsaw Pact with their Eastern European allies.
Right now you have Europe clearly divided not just by ideology, but by two massive opposing military blocs. The lines were drawn.
But containment wasn't always going to be about economics or airlifts, was it? As we move into the 1950s, the policy demanded boots on the ground, proxy wars.
That's the next phase, yes. And the first major military test case was the Korean War, starting in 1950. Remember, Korea was divided after World War II at the 38th parallel, Communist North backed by the Soviets, capitalist South backed by the U.S. In June 1950, the North invades the South.
And the U.S. leads a United Nations force to push them back.
They did. But here's where it got really complicated, and frankly, much bloodier than anticipated. The UN forces, mostly American, pushed the North Koreans way back, almost up to the Chinese border.
Which China saw as a threat.
A direct threat. So hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border, pushed the UN forces back south. After immense fighting and casualties on all sides, the war ended in 1953. Pretty much right back where it started, with Korea still divided at the 38th parallel. A brutal stalemate.
And the significance. It showed everyone the real cost in lives and money of military containment. This wasn't going to be easy or cheap. The U.S. realized it needed a permanent global military presence and readiness.
Yeah, figures like Richard Mills, handling strategic operations, and Jack Whelan, leading combat troops, they really embodied that massive commitment. And running alongside this military escalation was something even more terrifying. The nuclear arms race. The speed was just breathtaking. U.S. gets the atomic bomb in 1945. The Soviets test theirs in 1949, helped by espionage we now know. Then, just a few years later, 52, 53, both sides developed the hydrogen bomb, magnitudes more powerful.
Wow, that fast.
Incredibly fast. And this leads directly to the doctrine of MEME, mutual assured destruction.
Sounds cheerful.
Yeah. The logic was grim but simple. If either superpower launched a first strike, the other would still have enough nuclear weapons left to retaliate and utterly destroy the attacker. Total annihilation for both sides. So this terrifying balance of terror actually became the primary deterrent against a direct U.S.-Soviet war. It was too catastrophic to contemplate.
Okay, so with MAD now the terrifying backdrop, U.S. strategy had to evolve again, right? You can't just keep fighting costly proxy wars if the ultimate escalation is unthinkable.
Exactly. Enter John F. Kennedy. He brought in the idea of flexible response. The U.S. needed options besides massive nuclear retaliation. So strengthening conventional forces, special forces, but still keeping the nuclear deterrent.
And he faced the ultimate test of MAD during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
The closest the world ever came to nuclear war.
Yeah.
Soviet missiles in Cuba, U.S. blockade. But ultimately, it was resolved through intense back-channel diplomacy, precisely because full-scale war was unthinkable under Membedi.
And under Kennedy, we also see containment expanding geographically, don't we? Trying to win hearts and minds in Latin America with the Alliance for Progress.
Right.
But also deepening involvement in Southeast Asia, which tragically sets the stage for Vietnam.
It certainly does. But the next really big strategic shift, a genuine pivot, comes with Richard Nixon and his advisor Henry Kissinger in the late 60s, early 70s. They introduced détente.
The easing of tensions.
Yes, but it wasn't about suddenly trusting the Soviets. It was pragmatic. Nixon was dealing with a country exhausted by Vietnam, massive domestic pressure, and the hard reality that the USSR had achieved rough nuclear parity. MAD was truly mutual now. So détente wasn't about ending the rivalry. It was about managing it differently, shifting the tools of containment away from constant confrontation towards negotiation and finding areas of limited cooperation to avoid blowing up the world.
And they had some major successes with this approach. Number one, the opening to China. That was brilliant strategically.
Absolutely brilliant. Playing the China card, as they call it. Suddenly, the U.S. had leverage over Moscow that it never had before. It completely changed the geopolitical triangle.
And achievement number two, arms control.
Right. SALT-MN, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, signed in 1972. For the first time, the superpowers agreed to put actual limits on certain types of strategic nuclear weapons, like ICBM launchers. It didn't end the arms race, not by a long shot, but it was a crucial step in managing it, in making the nuclear standoff slightly less unstable. It showed containment could now mean diplomacy and treaty making, not just confrontation.
So looking back over this whole period, 1945 to 1980, what really strikes you is that tension between continuity and change. The core goal limit communism contains Soviet power that stayed pretty constant.
The objective remained.
But the methods, they changed dramatically, from economic aid like the Marshall Plan and these decisive non-military actions like the Berlin airlift,
Yeah, the early successes.
then through the really bloody proxy wars like Korea, and eventually landing on this complex strategic negotiation, arms control, détente.
It's a fascinating arc. And if you zoom out, the whole Cold War was essentially about managing this intense ideological conflict without letting it tip over into nuclear war. Détente, diplomacy, saltimity, they hoped to reduce the immediate risk of military clashes. But the fundamental reality underpinning it all, right through 1980 and beyond, was still MAD, that terrifying balance. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, something for you, the listener, to think about, especially given today's world. If the only thing guaranteeing stability is the assurance of mutual destruction, is that really a sustainable foundation for peace in the long run? Or, put another way, are the deterrence strategies we still sometimes rely on today really suited for our current challenges? Or are they relics of that very specific, very dangerous MAD world?
That is definitely something to consider as we think about how these Cold War policies continue to shape our world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.